Dr. Power, the guests have arrived.
Oh, thanks, Jossie. Thanks very much. Well, hi, folks. Come on in. See, Blair, chair over there for you, and Kim, and Troy, welcome back from Disneyland. I understand your kids enjoyed it. That's wonderful. Took mine down there many, many times. Seemed like a lifetime ago, 50, 60 years ago, but it was memories forever, so glad to see you back. Sheila, it's just as cold here in Victoria as it is in White Horse today, so so let's move on. This is session 5. Glad you're here. This session we're going to move ahead and talk a bit about modes of entry and how to enhance your generic strategies. For information only, we're going to touch upon briefly public-private partnerships, because today increasingly all of you will or already have become involved in this animal of public-private partnerships. It's not new. It's been around for about 30 years. But it's some do's and don'ts and things they are good for using for and things that are not so good to be applied for. And already in the course, I think we talked in the prison system in the States, they're using them there, and certainly most of us have reservations about the wisdom of using P3s for prison institutions and the pressure on people to fill bed spaces. So that's a concern. Context case, I sent out the Sleeman's information on Friday night. No wrong or right answers, just some thoughts. But the purpose was, again, to get you thinking, using some models and a chance to talk to each other. There's no marks involved in it. But it was a couple of rehearsals we've had now getting ready for the individual case, which is coming up, where I'll give you the questions, which I'll not do in the exam, but the same process. Talk to your colleagues. The only thing I don't want to do is cut and paste collectively the same answer in 5 papers, but certainly talk to each other, see what tools you're going to use, what issues you see in the questions, just to help speed up the process. There are other questions too that could be raised, but I've given you some to turn your mind to, but it'll get you ready, and then it gets you ready to leapfrog then into your final exam. And let me digress for a moment into the final exam, made up of 2 parts. The second part will be a case, and the case I'll give to you on the Monday of our last week, week 8. I'll identify the case. It's in your textbook, and I encourage you to talk to your colleagues as to what questions, what issues they see in there. But the questions will be very similar in kind to what we did on the context cases and on the individual case. So just ask yourself what questions that old fart come up with, and you won't be too far off the mark. Practice those if you have time and interest in considering some questions, applying some tools, looking at some ratios, if financial ratios are there. But if the ratios are there, they're the key ones that in a little black book, you'll find them all set out in there on the cobbler case to give you a sense what they look like. What else is on the mind today? I'm recording this on a Monday. This is the big week here at the university. We have convocation coming up for you folks and the Faculty of Management. It's on Wednesday afternoons, but our IT folks are just running wild-eyed right now, getting it all set with the videos for the convocation itself, and then taking the videos during the convocation. So they squeezed me in here. So this is Monday. So the news I'm talking about today may seem a little stale dated because we've got all this week to go. You don't see it till a week from today, and so a lot of things will have gone under the keel of the boat by then as we go through it. But certainly I talked last week briefly about this thing that was happening in Saudi Arabia with the young prince. The senior king is not on deathbeds, but not. I think life expectancy is rather short. And so he's taking control of this place and shaking it up, and he's got a vision of where he's taking it. At the surface level, according to Sunday and Monday, today's reports, he's arrested a whole bunch of people within the organizations, and include the royal family members. One is some sort of a stepbrother, I suppose, who actually runs the National Guard, and has. When I say arrested, they're all put up in high-class 5-star hotels, but they're sort of kept out of harm's way for the time being. We have a chance to roll out, get control of, and get ready to implement this grand strategy he has for this whole new territory. That it seems to be emerging as you read this. He's going to drive this into the new century. He's going to make it more secular. He's going to go toe-to-toe with the Imams, and he's going to try to put Saudi Arabia back on a footing to be the power against the power of Iran. And so Iran, you have the Shia, and very much Saudi is sort of the champions for the Sunni. And he's trying to build this force back up, as well as reposition with the demise of oil, reposition into new industries, new businesses. But it's interesting, up to this point, within the last couple of years, Saudi's been a place of great pleasure for if you were born part of the royal family, which is extensive. cousins and all those sort of folks in that ruling class, your life was pretty easy. You're like a drone bee in a beehive. And so you brought in workers from Pakistan and other places to do all the work around the place, and you just sort of floated like a butterfly and drove Mercedes and lived rather well. But I think that is gone. The reality is that right now, while they have financial reserves, they're running debt and deficit. They're running deficits every year, and they're getting concerned about it. And so, just like Dubai, he's trying to reposition and actually put to work this large, extensive family into real, meaningful jobs, and retrain them and reboot them, all the stuff we talk about in this class. And so there's a brand new, fresh breeze blowing through there. Dictatorship, yes. Different view of the hand of how this all should be done. But he's going to drive this. And so at the second level, even though he said it's about corruption, which maybe it certainly is there and it's there for all countries, etc., for some degree, this is really about a revitalization, a reorganization, I think, of Saudi. And watch that as it grows, because it has great implications for us. We have the Mendip Strait. There's two choke points in that area. One is Mendip Strait, just off Yemen, and the other one is up the Gulf of Hormuz, and that's where all the oil supply comes back and forth. And the Mendip Strait, of course, goes up into the Suez, and they're critical points. And so that's why this passage of land and this new state, or this new territory he's establishing, is important to you and I in crafting strategies and the success of it, and the access in our national security interest up and down those choke points. We want to watch for them. Part of the story too I read in there is the Yemen last night, Sunday. Again, this is long. Apparently fired a missile into Saudi. And down there we have the terrorists. The tribe is the Houthis, and the Houthis fired this missile. But the reality is the Houthis don't have missiles unless they get them from somebody. In this case, a pretty strong line dot connection would go to the Iranians, the Shia, giving missiles to the Houthi, who are now firing them into the Sunnis and into Saudi Arabia. And so that's a declaration of war. And so the things are heating up there at this sort of level. We watch for it. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but watch for it as it unfolds this week. I've got my briefs in from some people. This one is the Stratford, I think, coming in, talking about the U.S. ignores the Sub-Saharan Africa to its own peril. And it's often we talk about Africa like it was a state. It's not. It's 54 states. And in those, in the continent of Africa, there are very big, powerful states. Like Nigeria is a powerhouse about to emerge and percolate as something to be reckoned with. South Africa, having some difficulties economically these days, but nevertheless a good, strong borders on being one of the BRIC nations in there. We often include it with Brazil as one of the BRIC nations. Anyway, we see these sub-Saharan African nations in there are a concern, and America and Trump has been cutting back on the handouts, the free money, and with the cutback of the free money, all of a sudden, less response from these African nations to do the bidding of or listen to or give support to the Americans, both at the United Nations and other places, because there's no money, then there's no need to follow the direction. And we see more of that coming in. And we talked in terms of Go and Chess and the Chinese, wherever there's a void left, they come and fill with their offerings of funds and one thing or another. In fact, I talked a few minutes ago about this new state, and 5% of the national oil company of Saudi Arabia was going to be put up to help fund this new package. Well, guess who's going to buy 5%? The Chinese. And that will give them great influence in that whole new territory coming in. So there's lots of pieces moving around the chessboard we need to watch for. In Africa, Guyana's petroleum future didn't have much a few years ago. It was very sparsely populated, a bit of a backwater, but they've found oil and gas off the coast, and all of a sudden it's becoming a very interesting place. ExxonMobil are moving in there and doing a bunch of discoveries and doing well. The European Union, this report talks in terms of it's riddled with overlapping problems. It's got the euro currency crisis. It talks in terms of diverging policies on Russia and Turkey and how to deal with them. Certainly we talk about Turkey and the Muslim crescent that could be formed if it can't get into the EU in that area. Irregular migration patterns of people coming across the Mediterranean and up and around through Turkey. Brexit, of course, is a concern. Rising of nationalism, terrorism, Euroscepticism. There's a whole bunch of percolating challenges for the European Union, and they're trying to sit down, regroup, rethink the leaders, the directing minds of the European Union on how are we going to clean this mess up, because there's all sorts of problems. The wheels are falling off over there. Stratford, again, the report, Horizons, talks about ransomware attacks. They're increasing. It's a common threat. In fact, today I talked one of the universities here in Canada was hit with that just this week. Podcast on blockchain and Bitcoin. I get a great report on Bitcoin, digital currencies, and what we see there, just to digress for a minute, is that we've talked about the blockchains and Bitcoin itself, but increasingly now the governments are getting involved. The UK's got its own Bitcoin currency coming out, cryptocurrency, as has the Americans coming out with one. And the general process for both of them is that in the States they'll approve a number of banks. You can go into the bank, put your money in the counter, buy the hard asset gold. They will hold it for you. And so that bank holds your gold, but they give you a certificate. You take that back then to this clearinghouse, and once you can show them evidence, proof of purchase that you've got this, then the government will run this Bitcoin currency system for you, backed by your gold in a U.S. system. But the danger of that is the government knows exactly what you've got. And under the other system, as we see with Kim Jong-un, the public sector Bitcoin currency is it's not controlled by any government. It's outside government. And so we see that there's a bashing taking place. Increasingly, governments are hammering down and throwing credibility questions about these early emerging Bitcoin currencies, but they're promoting their own. And I've got a great report on that. In fact, I'll put it up. I was talking with Joshua about it from Calgary, and very interested in finance and fintech and one thing or another. I think what I will do is I'll send it out to all of you, and if you have time, have a look at it. It's a fascinating read on that background paper and that sort of area. I don't know how much more. Nuclear fusion was something. Yeah, all sorts of reports on nuclear fusion as an alternative to some of the other energy systems, certainly in the sense of wind power and solar power out farther in front. But right behind it, there's breakthroughs coming through Arl as we speak. In fact, there was another one today that nuclear fusion was one, but they now have quark fusion, which is 8 times more powerful, 8 times more energy, developed by Tel Aviv and the University of Chicago, was just announced today. And these breakthroughs are such that it will produce more energy here than it takes in. It produces enough energy. They say the moon will have enough energy for 100,000 years for the Earth. And the Chinese are getting ready to go up there and actually mine it and get it into motion. And so I guess what I'm thinking about here is, again, the lifespan of the conventional fossil fuel oils and stuff we've talked about is just another nail in the coffin that as nuclear fusion comes into play, it will start putting some pressure on, reducing the demand-supply curve of the traditional way we have our energy systems. So that was one little report in. The Economist this week, lots of good stuff in it, but again, like the Globe, it's got a heavy bias to the left. But I had to bring this out. It's the idea of interest to all of us, and that's the MBA demise, whether it's exaggerated or not. And of interest, I thought you might know, is that they list the top 20 universities according to their rankings. Northwestern Kellogg is number 1. The average salary for graduates within 3 months of leaving there, of graduating with the MBA, is $123,998 in U.S. funds. The cost of the program is $133,000. Next is Chicago, Harvard, and Wharton. And Wharton, I'll read because it's near and dear to my heart. It's the most expensive course, $153,000 to pay for your course. And within 90 days of leaving there, 98% of the graduates received jobs that paid on an average $130,000 and change. Stanford was behind them. MIT was at the bottom of the rung, 19. Cost of the course was $142,000. And the average salary is $126 when they stepped out. But there's a debate about MBAs and the role for them, and the near Masters of Business. They have these Masters of Management. Royal Roads is a bunch of them, like the Masters in International Business, etc. That they're not the same thing as an MBA, but they're Masters in Management. And generally don't need a GMAT as we go through it, as ours doesn't. But they're starting to eat the cake of master's programs. And so the question we could talk about is the role of an MBA today. Is it worth the money you're paying for it? Indeed, the question becomes with a Master's of Management, is it really a profession? I mean, a law degree, you do an undergraduate degree as you would normally do in a Master's of Business program, an undergraduate. Many of you have stepped over that with a challenging of 10 years or so management experience. And after that, in law, you do 3 years of law and a year articling, and you get a profession. In medicine, it's kind of the same. 3 years, you go into that area. And you folks are doing 2 years, and sometimes a little more, plus a paper. And so it's almost the equivalent in time spent in university of a profession. And there's been other institutions that have asked you to sign a pledge, take an oath, that you really take on some responsibility. You have a duty. Once we put a stamp on you saying you are a master in business, that should be the same thing as a stamp you're a lawyer, or a stamp you're an accountant, or a stamp you're a dentist. And if that's the case, would you go along with that? And if you transgress that, would you have the ability to take your masters away from you? A thought. Strange things we talk about. Bloomberg this week, a bunch of things. I'll move very quickly through it if I can. The $18 billion sent by George Soros to his Open Society foundations. He's got hundreds of these little Open Society foundations. You read a bunch of them in the States right now that are hard left, and he funds those to take to the streets and do the things he's doing. It's a philanthropy he set up, focused on refugees, which you see a lot of coming into Europe. He's behind that, and supports and funding and helping. Hate crimes, he fights against that, public health, etc. But it's interesting that a lot of these rich folks are taking, I think Buffett did about the same amount of money, $18 billion, and transferred it over to these sort of, the Clinton Foundation, those sort of foundations, etc. And they get the tax deduction. The $18 billion is over here. But you're able to set up in perpetuity then jobs for your children as executive directors and whatever good salaries, running and operating these foundations. And it's a neat thing for those with pennies to be able to do. NAFTA negotiations reject with the U.S. hard line going on, not going extremely well. It's been put off till 2018, I think, to come back to the table now. Bombardier is just, as you know, was bought out. The Airbus bought out a chunk of them. And just today, after being bought out a week or so ago, 50% of it, they ended up landing a great number of sales for the C series planes in Europe, which is enough to help revitalize. In fact, the problem is they plan on putting 30 of their jets out next year, and they've got production problems with Pratt & Whitney that's going to put them down to 2/3 of that, so they're not going to be able to, even though they've got the orders, they can't fill them, which is not a good thing. Raqqa, we talked about that last week. Let's see what else we got here. This was interesting. 3D printing shows a couple of young people in university. They've put their minds together, a small factory, 3D printers. They're producing rockets for the moon, and they've cut the cost per launch by 90%. The 3D printing. They expect to have them up by 20. I think was the date the first one goes off. In any event, they're just they get the metal in, the aluminum in, and it just goes and prints, and they can produce these things without mistakes. And it's stronger apparently because it's one continuous weld as opposed to bits and pieces bolted on. And the liquid metal, they do 8 inches of the side of the tube coming up in per second. 8 inches worth of liquid metal per second. In garbage-sized cans, building in a few hours, and it can withstand immense heat. So it's interesting. The finished product, mid-2020s, be 90-foot tall, 7-foot wide rocket, carry 2,000 pounds into orbit, and it's only at a $10 million launch price instead of $100 million, which is the current going rate. So that was a breakthrough. Twitter, fake news, etc. Well, I won't read the whole article, but it triggered the thought, of course, with the president's Twitter account being closed down for 11 seconds the other day, notwithstanding what you think of President Trump. I'm certainly a supporter, and that's his media for getting it out. But we all have different views of the hand, and that's fine. But nevertheless, what's more important to me is these omnipresent large organizations and the power they have to censor your thoughts and my thoughts, and democracy is really an issue. And there's an example. If you can do it to the president, if they don't have the checks and balances in, what can they do to you? And so we all should be on guard for that and start thinking about the need to get control of these people. U.S. lags behind China on cyber threats. We've talked a bit about that already. Oh, Frankfurt is lukewarm on BRICS. There's this fight as the financial center for the globe and for Europe, certainly, between the London Centre and the Frankfurt Centre, and with the British organisation pulling out of the European Union in a couple of years, the question becomes, will all the financial centre that was in London migrate over to Frankfurt? And they go the different costs and one thing or another in here, but it certainly is a question. And there's some evidence that large bodies of the headquarters folks are transferring from here over to Frankfurt and setting up over there. And so we might want to watch that as to where the center of the financial markets will be on the global market exchange, etc. Let's see quickly what's in the paper here if we can go through it. U.S. puts a punitive duty on software. We talked a bit about this. Between 20 and 23% is going in place on Canadian lumber, BC lumber, Alberta lumber, maritime New Brunswick lumber going in. Has got this penalty on it. Not a good thing. 60,000 direct jobs are going to be impacted by this, certainly just in BC. Our Foreign Affairs Minister, Christian Freeland, and Natural Resource Minister have called them punitive duties, unfair, unwarranted, deeply troubling. They're going to urge the administration to do something. But the reality is this has been going on for years, and without any resolution. We take it to the adjudication tribunals, both with the NAFTA set up, as well as with the World, in this case, World Trade Organization. Often, in most cases, we win. America just refuses to acknowledge it, and we push on again. Not a good state of affairs. It all arises out of the stumpage fee and how it's calculated, and it's the private system versus the government system. Plato and Aristotle. In the States, the forests are privately owned, and I own 600 acres of forestry, and I take care of it for 20, 30 years. I clean it, I watch over it, take the risk that fire could wipe me out, and then I go and harvest it, and I put it on the market to sell. In Canada, the model is the government owns most of the forests, and what they do is they put up certain tracts available for auction each year, and we come put a bid in. But all that 20, 30 years of risk is gone, and I pay a stumpage fee. And the Americans' argument is that basically that stumpage fee is too low for what they're expending down south, so it's an unfair advantage to Canada. On most occasions, we win the debate as it goes through, but it's a challenge. But it indicates to me something we could talk about is the strength of lobbyists. The lobbyist for the lumber industry in America obviously has the ear of government and the directing minds to get this sort of outcome, but the consumers of a whole are suffering. All this rebuilding that has to take place because of the hurricanes and things they've had down south, and other building is great building time in the States. The cost of lumber is going up like mad because demand-supply curve. If they can't get it from here, or there's a 23% increase in the cost of it, the cost of that house goes up by 23% for the inputs. And so really the consumers are being hurt by government's interference and picking winners and losers. So we could talk a bit about that as one thing we should know a bit about as strategists. Bombardier big series order we just talked about. Waste more time on that right now. There's a two-story in here that one part was troubling, the other part was equally troubling. First, let me deal with the federal environmental minister, Catherine McKenna, at a news conference. Media, I never heard of them, called Rebel Media, apparently in their language have been referring to her as Climate Barbie on the World Climate Exchange. Most unfair, and so she fought back the other day and did a good job of a good exchange with them and hammered away. But it came at the same time that her colleague, 50% as pointed out of the Trudeau cabinet are women, and a good thing that certainly balances it. But here is the Governor General Judy Payette as a keynote speaker for the Canadian Science Policy Convention in Ottawa on Wednesday night. And she's an engineer by trade, and she's an astronaut, and something that Canada's proud of. And she talks in terms, but one of her speech was talking about that we're still debating and questioning whether humans have a role in Earth warming and whether there's something we can do about it. And she takes a position, as I read this, and makes fun of and got some laughs from the crowd about it, that it can't be questioned anymore. She goes on and talks about news and bogus scientific claims have to be refuted, and that we have to be vigilant on the science topic. It's well known and understood, and so they should attack. And part of what she, going back to the Minister Catherine McKenna said some of her critics accused McKenna of using derogatory language herself by describing those who doubt climate change, they call them deniers, a word commonly used to describe those who doubt the Holocaust. And that's troubling, because we should be able to have that debate without throwing those sort of charges against one party or the other. And so both is troubling. One is that we use the words climate Barbie to describe our political leaders and not pay the respect the offices do, etc., etc. But also we shouldn't just close down debate by saying conspiracy theory or these are really just opinions. Conspiracy theories are just opinions. And I am one of those that stand up and say that there's certainly some evidence on the other side that we should look at whether or not, as individuals, as humans, can we change the climate. Certainly a quick Google will tell you that most methane from cows produces far more pollutants in the air than people do. And anyway, there's much to the argument. I'd like to discuss it a little bit again this week and get some sense, no wrong, right answers as to where you stand and what terrain you're comfortable with. But look at some of the evidence. You make your own decision as to where you come down on. Fraser Valley University investigate the possible breach of student info. Just we're talking about that we're not hardened up here in North America as Russia and China are on hacking. Vancouver's opening up a second office in, Amazon's opening up a second office in Vancouver. It's not the headquarters everybody's talking about, but they got a second office. The Fed chairman has been nominated to replace the current president down below, Janet Yellen. He is a fellow called Jerome Powell. Not an economist by trade, not an academic, hasn't written a bunch of journals, but he's a very astute businessman who's been involved in the exchange over the years and knows the applied and practical side of the house. And they think it'll be much of the same. They think he'll be reasonably responsive on keeping the monetary policy of the states where it's supposed to be to support the president's initiatives as we go forward. It's interesting in his background that he was at the Carlyle Group, and the Carlyle Group is one you should look at and be aware of. It's a private organization owned in part of the Bush family and majors from Britain and other political leaders put together, and they're a consulting team and get inside and attend some very high-level meetings on what goes on. So worth looking at there. When you talk in terms of the Fed, even the Federal Reserve is a misnomer. The Federal Reserve has nothing to do with the federal government in the States. It's a private organization. It was put together in 1913 in a back room on a train, actually, at Christmas Eve by a bunch of folks, Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and the Rothschilds and a few other names got together and did a deal with Wilson, who was the president at the time, and set up this agreement to take the control of the monetary policy. That's the ability to go down the basement and print money to make sure there's the right amount of paper floating around, borrowing the right amount of paper to make sure that paper will float around, to support the economics and the needs of the demand-supply curve of the nation. And unlike Canada, we have a Bank of Canada that does that. It's kept in-house. Here they put it outside government, and there's arguments for and against both that. And we should understand a little bit about how the Federal Reserve in the States works and how the Canadian Bank of Canada works. Wouldn't be hurt to have a little exploring look at that today. In Alberta, a big home building company went into receivership. Sorry about that, but it was imbalance and overbuilding, and the trouble they're having there with the fall of the oil prices, etc. Certainly, I note with interest the oil prices are up high, about $56 today, and that's surprising. But I think it's part of this element of risk of the risks, the choke points I'm talking about, and what's going on in the Middle East, and the other little flashpoints that are happening around the world is putting oil up higher. I still think that's very short-lived, unless something untoward happens, black swans, etc. I think you see it settle back down for more near to midterm in the $50 to just under $50 range for a long period of time, from one of my readings. Canada is going to admit 340,000 immigrants annually by 2020. That's quite a lift because we were down at 250 is what we've been doing. So 340 is a big bump up. They're going to make sure that the immigration minister, Hamid Hussein, says we're going to make sure that people are going to be given the tools they need to succeed once they get here. Maybe I didn't show you that. The unemployment rates came out in Canada last week. And as I recall, the best in Canada was Victoria, about 3.8% unemployment. Newfoundland was in the 14-18% range. St. John, New Brunswick, Halifax, Quebec, high unemployment rates. And so my question is, should we give it the tools and what they need to get to the existing Canadians first? Just a thought as we go through this. But certainly the Conservative side that the immigration system stands plagued with problems that have to be addressed. But so we're going to increase the numbers of immigrants coming into Canada by 2020 and going to give them the tools and wherewithal to get up and underway. And there's no question we're going to need some for social safety nets, but they've got to be the right bums in the right seats. Foreign oil sands exit in Alberta, again with the price of oil of recent date, it's driven out a number of foreign oil companies that on the tar sands say, no, this is not going to work for us. And the same thing's happened with fracking in the States with the regulations and the cost. Many of those folks have just wrapped it up and put it on the shelf and said it's just too overly regulated and too complex to make it happen. We're just going to stick it over here a little bit. But anyway, a couple of other companies have stepped in. Canadian Natural Resources stepped in, and I think one of our colleagues in the class works for Cenovus Energy. Both stepped in, picked up some of the pieces they were leaving as they departed, and are doing extremely well with them, making some money. So good for those two companies. Lebanese Prime Minister quits, denounces Iran, all part of what we talked about, this fight for regional control between the Iranians, the Shia, and the Sunni with the Saudis. And Lebanese Prime Minister, while visiting Saudi Arabia, stepped down. He says it's just too difficult as Iran spreads its evil in the region. And so it's going to make some instability, as it will, in Lebanon. It's going to turn them back into this, again, this tension between who's going to rule, Sunnis or Shia, and that's what's going to happen. There's going to be an ongoing fight on a religious basis there. It's disappointing. I went to Lebanon many years ago. I remember flying in. It was a white, almost alabaster city, a beautiful thing. The airport was right on the Mediterranean. A picture place. This was just after the '67 war with Israel. And flying in, and went to the Casino de Lebanon was another marvelous sight. But the point was, it was a financial center at that point for that area, and very quickly it got destroyed, primarily by the Israelis coming down and bombing and ripped it apart, and it's never recovered. It's never been that jewel of the Mediterranean it once was, and it's a shame. It's a nice country, nice people, and Christians or heavy Christians are there. One of my best friends was a professor from Lebanon. In any event, top Saudi princes, we did that one. So I think that's a lot of the stuff there. I might send that out to you too. I've got the Industrial Revolution, another article by Price Waterhouse. But it's interesting that it's stale dated. They just released it, but the data in it is, our stuff is fresher in the course on what we're doing. But I may send it out to you anyway to have a look at that report. I think, folks, we've had a pretty good run at it today. Hope you're having fun with it all. Again, on weekends, I'll be around to help you. Continue to have fun, of course. Bye now.